What's up, guys? I was going through some of the Nintendo shareholder questions, and there was one that kind of caught my eye a little bit. Now, this of course is no way confirmed at all, but I saw the question and it was answered in kind of a strange way that caught me off guard, and it had me thinking, is it possible that instead of the Nintendo 64 Classic in the works coming up, we get something like a Game Boy Advance Classic? Let me explain to you guys what I'm thinking here. So most of you probably know the other day they had the Nintendo Shareholder Conference where shareholders were allowed to ask, usually bigger shareholders, were allowed to ask different figureheads from Nintendo, including Miyamoto and Kimishima, what is going on exactly. They asked some dumb questions, they asked some good questions. But again, the question that caught my eye was question 9, this one. Where is the Game Boy Advance Virtual Console? And this is a good question because we've had Game Boy Advance Virtual Console on the Wii U, right? We've seen games released on there. There's still some games we would hope to be released, but for the most part, they haven't released any Game Boy Advance games really at all on portable systems like the 3DS. The only time we had Game Boy Advance games on the 3DS was through the Ambassador program, so we know, yeah, Game Boy Advance games can run fine on the 3DS, but for some reason they've made this decision not to put it on any portable consoles. I think what this person was trying to get at was, when are these Game Boy Advance games going to show up on the Switch? But they answered it in a different way that I think a lot of people were a little confused about. Looking at ways to develop Virtual Console, Classic Mini is one form of Virtual Console. We can also sell physical, looking to make it as big as we can. And that's interesting because, again, they bring up the fact that they're making these physical systems and kind of selling them during Christmas time for either brand awareness, or maybe if they start planning it out better, unlike they did with NES Classic, maybe they actually make some money on these things. And it's interesting that for some reason, Game Boy Advance Virtual Console then turns into the Classic Mini line of physical hardware that they're selling. And that kind of got me thinking, well, we're probably following the timeline in our minds of Nintendo, Super Nintendo, and a lot of us are already thinking about, hey, maybe a Nintendo 64 Classic is coming out like next year. And I thought about it, but the way that they're probably going to emulate the Super Nintendo is going to have to do with ARM and maybe cheaper ARM processors, for example, like they kind of did with NES Classic. And the Nintendo and Super Nintendo games are much easier to emulate compared to the Nintendo 64. And that kind of made me think, well, maybe they'll take a little extra time with the Nintendo 64 and jump to the next easiest thing to emulate, which are Game Boy Advance games. And there's some cool stuff they could do there. Obviously, there's a vast library with the Game Boy Advance, especially if you're only picking 20, 24 games, something like that, like they're kind of doing with the Super Nintendo Classic. I mean, can you imagine if they threw like a Pokemon game on there, like Zelda Minish Cap, Metroid? There are so many games they could pull from the Game Boy Advance library that I'm sure you guys could answer down in the comments a game you would love to see, or even your lineup of games on the Game Boy Advance. I mean, they could even pull from some of the most expensive games and really damage the collector's library with something like Ninja 5.0 going to the Game Boy Advance. But consider this. We have not seen Mother 3 at all released outside of Japan, and all of a sudden, Star Fox 2 shows up on the Super Nintendo Classic as a massive selling point. What happens if the Game Boy Advance Classic does happen next year and they put Mother 3 as the big poster game? That would be really interesting because it would definitely drive massive sales for a Game Boy Advance Classic. Not to mention, what if it's just a system you plug into your TV with HDMI out? What if it's not even a handheld? Sure, they could make a handheld system, but what if they decide to go the other route like they are with these systems, where they're just kind of like HDMI, tiny little systems running on ARM processors? They could easily do it with the Game Boy Advance. I also had this weird thought that they could do something like I took a look at Neo Geo X, and that was kind of a hybrid system. That could be possible as well. Although I think personally, I would rather them work to bring like the box to market that plays Game Boy Advance games and then save the portable aspect for the Switch, because I'm sure they will eventually put Game Boy Advance games on the Switch. And they could still kind of coexist if you think about it that way, because keep in mind, one is tethered to the TV, whereas the other one is a more premium option where you can remove it and take it with you portably. That might be something worth keeping with the Switch. And if it's just an ARM system, like with an ARM processor that then just runs Game Boy Advance games, it could also be cheap, much like the Nintendo Classic and the Super Nintendo Classic. For what you're getting, the Super Nintendo Classic at $80 is cheap. But this was just a thought I had, guys. I kind of wanted to just talk about it a little bit, and I'm curious what your thoughts are on a lineup of Game Boy Advance games. There's some really good ones to pick out there. I honestly think if they were going to do it, they would probably only take one Pokemon game, so I wouldn't list all the Pokemon games if I were you. I would pick out some other ones, and just really a couple that you would love to see. I do think if they did get it, Mother 3 would make a ton of sense to put on the front of the box, because as soon as they slap that on there, pre-orders will sell out every single time. And they could probably bring it out as a $70 to $80 system, much like the Super Nintendo Classic. And again, if it's tethered to the TV, the Switch can coexist with it. That's it for now, guys. I'll see you next time.